In the rolling hills of Virginia, 1815, where mist clung to the valleys like a mourner's veil, stood Monroe Estate. Its whitewashed columns gleamed against the backdrop of ancient oaks, a testament to the prosperity of Thomas Monroe, one of the region's most respected tobacco planters. His only daughter, Abigail, was the pride of his life, a young woman of 20 with chestnut hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. On a crisp October morning, Abigail stood at her bedroom window watching the sun break through the mist. Her wedding dress lay across her bed, a creation of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had arrived from Richmond just yesterday. In 3 days she would marry William Harrington, the son of a neighboring plantation owner. It was a union that promised to unite two of Virginia's oldest families. "Miss Abigail," came the soft voice of Sarah, her lady's maid since childhood, "your father wishes to see you in his study." Abigail found her father standing by the hearth, his face grave. "My dear," he said, taking her hands in his, "I've received troubling news. There's been an outbreak of fever in Charlottesville. 3 families have already succumbed." Fear clutched at Abigail's heart. Fever had taken her mother 7 years prior, leaving a wound that had never fully healed. "I've spoken with Reverend Clark. He agrees it would be prudent to postpone the wedding until the danger is past. But, Father, everything is prepared. William's family has traveled from as far as Boston." Thomas Monroe's expression softened. "Your safety is worth more than any inconvenience. William understands this. He loves you too dearly to risk your health." Later that evening, William came to call. In the garden, surrounded by late-blooming roses, he held Abigail's hands in his. At 25, William Harrington cut a handsome figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with earnest blue eyes that had always looked upon Abigail with adoration. "It's only a postponement," he assured her. "I would wait an eternity to make you my wife." Abigail smiled, though anxiety still fluttered in her chest. "Promise me, William. Promise me that nothing will keep us apart." "I promise," he said, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Not fever, nor storm, nor any power on this earth will prevent me from making you my bride." Neither could have known how that promise would be tested, nor the darkness that would descend upon Monroe Estate before the week was through. That night, as Abigail prepared for bed, she felt a strange chill despite the fire crackling in her grate. Her reflection in the mirror looked pale, her eyes unusually bright. By morning she would feel the first grip of the fever that would soon consume the household. The fever came swift and merciless. By dawn, Abigail's forehead burned like fire, her nightgown soaked with sweat. Sarah found her thrashing in her bedsheets, muttering incoherently about wedding bells and promises. Dr. Bennett was summoned immediately. He arrived with his leather case and grim expression, the lines around his mouth deepening as he examined Abigail. "It's the same fever that's taken hold in Charlottesville," he informed Thomas Monroe, who stood ashen-faced by his daughter's bedside. "I've seen it move through families with frightening speed. What can be done?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cooling cloths. Willow bark tea for the fever. Keep her comfortable." The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. Many who contracted this fever did not recover. Word was sent to the Harrington estate. William arrived by midday, his horse lathered from the hard ride. He was not permitted to see Abigail, the risk of contagion too great, but he remained at Monroe Estate, sleeping in the guest quarters, praying for his betrothed's recovery. By the 3rd day, 3 servants had also fallen ill. Thomas Monroe ordered the estate quarantined. No one was to enter or leave until the fever had run its course. On the evening of what should have been her wedding day, Abigail's condition worsened dramatically. Her breathing became labored, her once rosy lips tinged blue. Dr. Bennett administered laudanum to ease her suffering, but the fever had too fierce a grip. "William," she called in her delirium, "you promised." Thomas Monroe sent for Reverend Clark, who arrived wearing a cloth mask soaked in vinegar, futile protection against the invisible killer. He administered last rites as Abigail's breathing grew more shallow. In the hall outside her bedroom, William confronted Dr. Bennett. "There must be something more you can do," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. The doctor shook his head. "Medicine has its limits, Mr. Harrington. Some forces are beyond our control." At midnight, as rain lashed against the windows of Monroe Estate, Abigail Monroe drew her final breath. Her father collapsed in grief beside her bed. William, upon hearing the news, disappeared into the storm, his anguished cries lost in the howling wind. The bride-to-be was buried the next morning in the Monroe family plot, her wedding dress serving as her burial gown. The ceremony was brief, attended only by those at the estate, the quarantine still in effect. William stood motionless beside her grave, rain mingling with tears on his face. "You promised nothing would keep us apart," he whispered as the first shovelful of earth fell upon her coffin. "And I intend to keep that promise. Even now." None who heard those words could have foreseen their terrible significance, or the horror that would unfold in the days to come. The rain continued unabated through Abigail's burial, as if the heavens themselves mourned her passing. The family cemetery, situated on a gentle rise behind the Monroe mansion, became a muddy quagmire. The gravediggers struggled with their grim task, their spades slipping in the sodden earth as they lowered Abigail's simple pine coffin into the ground. Thomas Monroe stood supported by Dr. Bennett, his face a mask of grief. He had lost his wife to fever, and now his only child. The estate, with all its prosperity, suddenly seemed hollow, a monument to joys that would never return. William Harrington remained after the others had retreated to the house. The servants watched from windows as he stood motionless by the fresh grave, heedless of the downpour that plastered his clothes to his body. "He'll catch his death," Sarah murmured, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping for her young mistress. In the kitchen, cook crossed herself. "There's something unnatural in such grief. The young master has the look of a man whose soul has already departed." Indeed, when William finally returned to the house as dusk fell, his eyes held a vacant stare that unsettled all who saw him. He declined dinner and retired to the guest room he'd occupied during Abigail's illness. That night, the storm intensified. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the estate in brief, ghastly flashes. Thunder shook the foundations of the house. Few found sleep amidst nature's fury. In his study, Thomas Monroe sought solace in whiskey, drinking glass after glass as he stared at a portrait of Abigail as a child. Upstairs, William paced his room, occasionally stopping to gaze out at the cemetery visible through his window when lightning revealed it. Near midnight, a particularly violent thunderclap roused the household. Sarah, who had been dozing in a chair by the kitchen fire, was startled awake by what she thought was a scream. Listening intently, she heard only the storm's rage, until a pounding came at the back door. Sarah hesitated, fear prickling along her spine. No one should be abroad in such weather, especially with the quarantine in effect. The pounding came again, more insistent. "Who's there?" she called, approaching the door cautiously. No answer came, only another series of blows that made the thick oak door shudder in its frame. Sarah unbolted the door and opened it a crack. The wind immediately tore it from her grasp, flinging it wide. Rain and leaves blew into the kitchen. And there, illuminated by a flash of lightning, stood a figure in white, drenched and muddied, with dark hair plastered to a pale face. Sarah's scream brought the household running. Thomas Monroe arrived first, then Dr. Bennett, who had stayed to monitor the other fever patients. They found Sarah collapsed on the kitchen floor, pointing wordlessly at the open door. But there was no one there, only rain driving into the kitchen and muddy footprints leading inside. "Close the door," Thomas ordered, his voice hoarse with drink and grief. "The wind has unhinged it, nothing more." As servants moved to obey, Dr. Bennett knelt beside Sarah. "What did you see, girl?" Sarah's voice trembled. "It was Miss Abigail, sir. As I live and breathe, it was her in her burial dress, all soaked through. She's come back to us." Thomas Monroe's face contorted with anger. "That's enough. My daughter's dead and buried. Your hysteria dishonors her memory." But as they helped Sarah to her feet, all present noticed the trail of muddy footprints leading from the doorway into the house, small prints, the size of a young woman's foot, proceeding down the hall toward the main staircase. And upstairs, the sound of a door closing softly. The muddy footprints led up the grand staircase and along the corridor to Abigail's bedroom, a room that had been locked since her death, her father unable to bear the sight of her possessions. Now the door stood ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning from within. Thomas Monroe clutched the banister, his face ashen. "This is madness," he whispered. But his eyes followed the trail with undisguised terror. Dr. Bennett, ever the man of science, stepped forward. "Allow me," he said, taking a candle from a wall sconce. The flame wavered as he approached Abigail's room, casting grotesque shadows on the wallpaper. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The bedchamber beyond lay in darkness, the heavy curtains drawn against the storm. The candle's glow revealed an empty room, the four-poster bed still neatly made, Abigail's silver brush set arranged on her dressing table. "There's no one here," Dr. Bennett announced, his relief palpable. But as he turned to leave, the flame of his candle flickered violently, then extinguished altogether. In the sudden darkness, a soft sound emerged, the creak of floorboards from the far corner of the room near the wardrobe. Thomas Monroe fumbled for the doorframe. "Light another candle," he commanded, his voice cracking. Before anyone could comply, a flash of lightning illuminated the room through a gap in the curtains. For a brief, terrible moment, they all saw her, Abigail, standing before her wardrobe. Her burial gown sodden and caked with cemetery mud, her once beautiful face now a ghastly white mask, her eyes sunken and dark. In the returning darkness, Sarah's scream pierced the air. Servants scrambled in panic, some fleeing downstairs, others frozen in terror. Dr. Bennett backed out of the room, colliding with Thomas Monroe in the doorway. "Abigail?" Thomas called, his voice a mixture of hope and horror. "My child, is it truly you?" Another lightning flash revealed the room was empty once more. William Harrington, conspicuously absent during the commotion, was found in his guest room, sitting calmly by the window that overlooked the cemetery. When informed of the disturbance, he showed no surprise. "She made a promise," he said simply. "As did I." Dr. Bennett insisted on examining the grave at first light. The storm had abated by dawn, leaving behind a landscape glistening with rainwater. A small party, including Thomas Monroe, William, and several servants carrying shovels, made their way to the family plot. What they found defied rational explanation. The earth above Abigail's grave had been disturbed, not by the digging of any animal, but as if pushed upward from below. More disturbing still was the gaping hole at the head of the grave, just large enough for a slender person to crawl through. "Open it," Thomas commanded, his voice hollow. "I must know the truth." The servants hesitated, exchanging fearful glances, but eventually set to work. As they removed the rain-softened earth, William stood apart, his expression inscrutable. When the coffin was finally exposed and its lid pried open, a collective gasp arose from the witnesses. The coffin was empty. The wedding dress that had served as Abigail's burial gown lay within, arranged as if still clothing a body, but no corpse remained. Thomas Monroe collapsed to his knees in the mud. Dr. Bennett, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing, stammered about grave robbers or wild animals, explanations that rang hollow even to his own ears. Only William seemed unsurprised. He gazed into the empty coffin with an expression akin to satisfaction. "What have you done?" Thomas demanded, rounding on his would-be son-in-law. "What madness is this?" William's reply chilled all who heard it. "I kept my promise, sir. I said nothing would keep us apart, not fever, nor storm, nor any power on this earth, not even death." That evening, an uneasy silence settled over Monroe Estate. Thomas Monroe had retired to his study with a decanter of brandy, refusing all company. Dr. Bennett, his scientific skepticism, had ordered crosses nailed to every doorway, a concession to the servants' fears that surprised even himself. William Harrington maintained his strange composure, taking his evening meal alone in the dining room while the rest of the household huddled in the kitchen, exchanging whispered theories about the empty coffin and the muddy footprints. "It's not natural," Cook insisted, kneading bread dough with unusual vigor. "The dead should remain dead." Sarah, who had been closest to Abigail in life, seemed the most affected by the night's events. "Perhaps she doesn't know she's dead," she suggested, her voice quavering. "Perhaps she's confused, poor thing." As darkness fell, the servants prepared for another night of terror. No one wished to sleep alone. Pallets were arranged in the kitchen and the servants' hall. Candles were lit in every room, their warm glow a futile defense against the encroaching night. Thomas Monroe eventually emerged from his study, his eyes bloodshot, his movements unsteady. He announced his intention to keep vigil in Abigail's room. "Father, you must rest," William urged, appearing suddenly in the hallway. "Allow me to stand watch instead." But Thomas was adamant. "She is my daughter. If she returns, if by some miracle or curse she walks among us, I must be the one to face her." Dr. Bennett insisted on accompanying him. "I'll bring my medical bag," he said. "There may yet be a scientific explanation for all of this." As they climbed the stairs to Abigail's room, William watched them go, a strange smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Abigail's bedroom had been thoroughly searched in the daylight hours. Nothing unusual had been found, no hidden passages, no evidence of intrusion beyond the muddy footprints, which had dried to dusty smears on the polished floorboards. Thomas Monroe took a seat in the armchair by the window, while Dr. Bennett positioned himself near the door. A clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the minutes, each sound amplified in the tense silence. "What do you believe happened last night?" Thomas asked eventually, his voice barely audible. Dr. Bennett hesitated. "I believe in science and rational explanation, but I also believe there are aspects of our world that science has yet to comprehend fully. You think my daughter has returned from the grave. It was not a question. I think something has occurred that defies conventional understanding." The hours crept by. Midnight came and went. Dr. Bennett fought against encroaching drowsiness, pinching himself to remain alert. Thomas Monroe stared fixedly at the bedroom door as if willing it to open. At precisely 3 o'clock, the hour that folklore designated as the devil's time, a cold draft swept through the room. The candles flickered but did not extinguish. Both men sat up straighter, senses heightened. The doorknob turned slowly. Thomas gripped the arms of his chair. Dr. Bennett reached for the cross he had begun carrying in his pocket. The door swung open to reveal William Harrington. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, stepping into the room. "I couldn't sleep and thought I might join your vigil." Relief and disappointment mingled in Thomas Monroe's expression. "Of course," he said, gesturing to a vacant chair. William took his seat, and the vigil continued in silence. Occasionally strange sounds emanated from elsewhere in the house, creaking floorboards. The rustle of fabric, once even what seemed like distant weeping. Each time the three men exchanged glances but remained in their positions. As dawn approached, Thomas Monroe finally succumbed to exhaustion, his head nodding forward onto his chest. Dr. Bennett, too, found his eyelids growing heavy. William alone remained alert, his gaze fixed on the wardrobe in the corner of the room, the same wardrobe near which the apparition had been glimpsed the previous night. Just as the first pale light of day crept through the window, the wardrobe door swung open with a soft creak. Dr. Bennett jerked awake, blinking rapidly. The wardrobe was empty, its interior visible in the gray morning light. "Nothing there," William observed calmly. "Perhaps our fears have been unfounded." But as Dr. Bennett rose to inspect the wardrobe more closely, he noticed something unusual, a faint, sweet smell emanating from within. The scent of roses, Abigail's favorite flower, mingled with something else, something earthy and corrupt. And at the bottom of the wardrobe, nearly hidden in the shadows, lay a single muddy footprint. By the following evening, unease had given way to terror at Monroe Estate. 2 kitchen maids had fled, preferring the uncertainties of the road to the horrors within the house. The remaining servants moved in pairs, jumping at shadows, crossing themselves at every unexplained sound. Sarah alone maintained a strange composure. When questioned, she admitted to leaving flowers in Abigail's room, roses gathered from the greenhouse, arranged in a silver vase on the dressing table. "She always loved roses," Sarah explained, her eyes distant. "If she's returned to us, I want her to feel welcome." This sentiment was not shared by Dr. Bennett, who had spent the day consulting his medical texts, searching for documented cases of apparent death followed by revival. He found little to explain what they had witnessed, though he clung to rational explanations with increasing desperation. "Catalepsy," he suggested to Thomas Monroe, as they sat before the fire in the study that evening. "A condition where the body appears deceased but is merely in a state of profound immobility. Perhaps the fever induced such a state in Abigail, and we buried her prematurely." Thomas stared into the flames. "And she awoke in her coffin? Clawed her way out of the earth?" His voice broke. "My God, what suffering she must have endured." William Harrington entered the study without knocking, his face grave. "Mr. Monroe, there is something I must confess." Both men turned to look at him, startled by his abrupt entrance. "The night of Abigail's burial," William began, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was about to reveal, "I went to her grave. I was inconsolable, mad with grief." Thomas leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. "I had heard tales," William continued, "of a man in Richmond, a practitioner of arts not sanctioned by the church, a man who claimed knowledge of how to restore life to the recently deceased." Dr. Bennett inhaled sharply. "Necromancy? You speak of the blackest superstition." "I speak of desperation," William countered. "I loved Abigail. I had promised nothing would keep us apart. When she died, that promise haunted me." "What did you do?" Thomas demanded, rising from his chair. William met his gaze unflinchingly. "I performed a ritual at her graveside. I used her locket, the one containing a lock of her hair, and I spoke words taught to me by the man in Richmond. Words in a language I did not understand." Dr. Bennett made a sound of disgust, but Thomas raised a hand to silence him. "Go on." "The storm came as I completed the ritual. Quote, lightning struck a tree near the cemetery. I took it as a sign that my efforts had been acknowledged by something beyond our understanding." "And you believe this ritual caused my daughter to return from the dead?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "I believe Abigail has returned to fulfill our promise to each other," William replied. "But I fear she has not returned whole." As if summoned by his words, a scream echoed from upstairs, Sarah's voice, high and terrified. The 3 men rushed from the study, taking the stairs 2 at a time. They found Sarah backing out of Abigail's room, her face paper white. "She's here," she whispered. "Miss Abigail is here." Thomas pushed past her into the bedroom. The roses Sarah had left that morning were now scattered across the floor, their petals bruised and darkening. The bed coverings had been disturbed, as if someone had lain upon them. There, on the pillow, rested Abigail's silver hairbrush, the one that had been buried with her, placed in her coffin by her grieving father. "Where is she?" Thomas demanded, his voice cracking. "Where is my daughter?" A soft sound came from the adjoining dressing room, the whisper of fabric against wood. Thomas strode toward it, flinging open the door. The dressing room appeared empty at first glance, but as Thomas's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he discerned a figure huddled in the corner, partially concealed by hanging garments. "Abigail?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure stirred. Slowly, painfully, it rose to its feet. What emerged from the shadows bore only a passing resemblance to the vibrant young woman who had been Abigail Monroe. Her skin had the waxy pallor of death, her once lustrous hair hung in lank strands around her face. The burial gown, now stiff with dried mud, clung to her emaciated frame. But worst of all were her eyes, sunken, darkened, yet burning with an unnatural light as they fixed upon William Harrington. "You promised," Abigail said, her voice a dry rasp that bore little resemblance to her living tones. "You promised we would be together." William stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Abigail, my love," but Thomas Monroe thrust himself between them. "What have you done to my daughter?" he demanded of William, his voice breaking. "What manner of abomination have you created?" Night fell once more upon Monroe Estate, bringing with it a thick fog that curled around the columns and crept through every crack and crevice of the old house. Inside, an atmosphere of dread pervaded every room. The servants had been given leave to depart, and all but Sarah and cook had fled before sunset. Abigail had been returned to her bedroom, where she now sat motionless before her mirror, staring at her reflection with those terrible, knowing eyes. Thomas Monroe had ordered the door locked from the outside, a decision that tore at his heart but seemed necessary given his daughter's altered state. In the drawing-room below, Thomas confronted William Harrington, his grief having hardened into cold fury. "Explain yourself," he demanded. "What precisely did this ritual entail?" William paced before the fireplace, his earlier composure giving way to visible agitation. "The man in Richmond, he gave me a book, ancient and written in a script I could not decipher. He translated only what he claimed were the necessary passages. And you trusted this stranger?" Dr. Bennett interjected, his scientific skepticism now tinged with superstitious fear. "I was not in my right mind," William admitted. "Grief had consumed me. I would have done anything to have Abigail returned to me." Thomas's face contorted with anger. "You've brought back her body, perhaps some shadow of her soul, but that is not my daughter upstairs. That is a mockery of Abigail." William flinched as if struck. "I didn't understand the consequences. The ritual was supposed to restore her completely, to bring her back as she was." "There is always a price for defying the natural order," Dr. Bennett said softly. "Always." The conversation halted abruptly at the sound of breaking glass from upstairs. The three men exchanged alarmed glances before rushing to Abigail's room. Thomas fumbled with the key, his hands shaking as he unlocked the door. The bedroom window had been shattered from within, glass shards glittering on the floor like fallen stars. Abigail was gone. "She couldn't have survived such a fall," Dr. Bennett murmured, peering out at the ground 3 stories below. There was no sign of a body, only fog swirling in the darkness. "She has already survived death itself," William replied grimly. "I fear a mere fall would hardly impede her now." Thomas gripped Williams's arm with unexpected strength. "Find her," he ordered. "Whatever she has become, whatever you have made her, she is still my child. Find her before she comes to further harm." The search began immediately. Lanterns were lit and the grounds of Monroe Estate were systematically combed. Dr. Bennett took the gardens, Thomas the stables and outbuildings, and William the path leading to the family cemetery. It was William who found her, just as he had secretly known he would. Abigail stood before her own empty grave, the disturbed earth around it giving the impression of a wound in the landscape. She had gathered wildflowers, black-eyed. Susan's and Queen Anne's lace hand was arranging them where her headstone would eventually stand. "Abigail," William called softly, approaching with caution. She turned, those unnatural eyes fixing upon him. "My bridegroom comes," she said, her voice stronger now, though still bearing the hollow quality of one speaking from a great distance. "Have you come to fulfill your promise at last?" William stepped closer, drawn by love and guilt in equal measure. "Abigail, what are you remembering? Do you know what has happened to you?" "I remember the fever," she replied, her gaze drifting back to the empty grave. "I remember the darkness, the confinement. I remember the earth pressing down upon me, filling my mouth when I tried to scream." Her hands trembled as she continued arranging the flowers. "And I remember your voice, calling to me through the darkness, promising we would be together." William swallowed hard. "I never meant for this to happen. Not like this. Yet here I stand," Abigail said, rising to her full height. In the moonlight that now broke through the fog, she looked almost as she had in life, beautiful, albeit with an otherworldly pallor, neither fully alive nor truly dead. "Caught between worlds because of your promise." She reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his cheek. William shuddered but did not pull away. "Do you still love me, William?" she asked, her voice suddenly vulnerable, a glimpse of the Abigail who had been. "With all my heart," he answered truthfully. "Then honor your promise," she whispered, leaning closer. "Be with me forever." Her lips, cold as marble, pressed against his. William felt a chill spread through his body, starting from that point of contact and reaching toward his heart. He understood in that moment what she was asking of him, not marriage, but something far more permanent and terrible. "Abigail, no," he gasped, pulling away. "This isn't right. This isn't what either of us wanted." Her expression hardened, the brief vulnerability vanishing like mist in sunlight. "You promised," she hissed, her fingers now grasping his wrist with supernatural strength. "Nothing would keep us apart. Not fever, nor storm, nor any power on this earth." "Those were your words, William." I spoke in grief, in desperation, as did I when I clawed my way out of that coffin. Abigail's voice rose, echoing among the headstones. "I've fought through earth and roots and worms for you, William Harrington. I defied death itself to return to you. And now you would reject me?" William struggled to free himself from her grip, but Abigail's strength was inhuman. She began to drag him toward the open grave. What are you doing?" he cried, genuine fear replacing his earlier guilt and compassion. "Keeping our promise," Abigail replied, her face now a mask of cold determination. "We will be together, William. In life or in death, it makes no difference now." Thomas Monroe and Dr. Bennett, having found no trace of Abigail near the house, followed the path to the family cemetery. The fog had thickened, obscuring the moon and stars, forcing them to rely on their lantern's meager light. As they approached the cemetery gates, they heard voices, William's, raised in alarm, and another, lower and more resonant than Abigail's living voice had ever been.
Hurry.
Thomas urged, breaking into a run despite his age and the treacherous footing. Dr. Bennett followed, his medical bag clutched tightly in one hand, his lantern in the other. They arrived to find a struggle underway beside Abigail's open grave. William was on his knees at the edge of the pit, desperately grasping at roots and stones to prevent himself from being dragged further in. Abigail stood above him, her mud-stained burial gown now torn and filthy, her face twisted into an expression of rage that Thomas barely recognized. "Abigail," he called out, raising his lantern high. "Stop this at once." She turned at the sound of her father's voice, momentarily distracted. William seized the opportunity to wrench himself free from her grasp, scrambling away from the grave's edge. "Father," Abigail said, her voice softening slightly, "you should not have come." Thomas approached cautiously, handing his lantern to Dr. Bennett. "My child, what are you doing?" "Ensuring William keeps his promise," she replied, her gaze returning to her intended bridegroom, who now cowered behind a nearby headstone. "He swore nothing would keep us apart, not even death." "But this is not the way," Thomas pleaded, drawing closer still. "What you're attempting, it goes against nature, against God's will." "God's will?" Abigail laughed, a sound like dead leaves scraping across stone. "Was it God's will that I die on my wedding day? Was it God's will that I be buried alive in that wooden prison?" She gestured violently toward her coffin, still partially visible in the disturbed earth of her grave. Thomas flinched at her words. "Buried alive? Abigail, you were dead. The fever took you as it took your mother. I was not dead," Abigail shrieked, her voice echoing among the tombstones. "I was in a deep sleep, what the doctor might call a cataleptic state. I could hear everything, your weeping, the reverend's prayers, the rain on my coffin lid. But I could not move, could not speak, could not even open my eyes." Dr. Bennett stepped forward, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his fear. "Then the ritual William performed gave me the strength to break free of my paralysis," Abigail finished for him. "Too late to save my life, but enough to fulfill my promise to William." Her cold gaze fixed on her former fiancé once more. "A promise he seems unwilling to honor." "You speak of dragging him to his death," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "That is not love, Abigail. That is vengeance." "Perhaps they are the same for one such as I have become," she replied, a terrible sadness creeping into her tone. Thomas moved until he stood directly before his daughter, close enough to see the unnatural pallor of her skin, the emptiness behind her eyes. "Abigail," he said gently, "you must let go. Whatever force has allowed you to return, whatever unfinished business holds you to this earth, you must release it. Find peace." For a moment something of the true Abigail seemed to surface in her expression, a flash of the gentle, loving daughter he had raised. But it was quickly subsumed by the darker presence that now inhabited her form. "Peace?" she whispered. "There can be no peace for me now. I am neither living nor dead. I exist in the space between worlds, cold and alone. Her gaze drifted to William once more. Unless he joins me. William, seeing her attention returned to him, bolted from his hiding place, making a desperate dash for the cemetery gates. With inhuman speed, Abigail moved to intercept him, her cold hands grasping his shoulders. "You cannot escape me," she hissed. "Our souls are bound by your promise, by the ritual you performed." Thomas and Dr. Bennett rushed forward, but Abigail held up a warning hand. "Stay back," she commanded. "This is between my bridegroom and me. The ritual, Doctor," Bennett said suddenly, addressing William. "Did it involve an exchange? A life for a life?" William's eyes widened with dawning horror. The man in Richmond said nothing of an exchange. He spoke only of restoration, of reuniting soul with body. "Such things always demand balance," Dr. Bennett insisted. "The natural order must be maintained." "A life for a life," Abigail repeated, her voice hollow as a forgotten grave. "Is that what I've become? A harbinger of death rather than a bride?" Thomas moved closer to his daughter, ignoring the danger. "Abigail, listen to me. Whatever has happened, whatever William's ritual has done, you are still my daughter. Let me help you find peace." For a moment, Abigail's expression softened. Her grip on William loosened slightly, allowing him to draw a shuddering breath. "Father," she whispered, her voice briefly reminiscent of her living tones, "I'm so cold. So terribly cold." Thomas slowly removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders. "Come home," he urged. "We'll find a way to warm you." But as his hands touched her shoulders, Abigail stiffened. Her eyes, momentarily gentle, hardened once more. "No," she said firmly. "There is only one way to end this cold. Only one way to fulfill the promise." She turned back to William, who had begun inching away during her moment of distraction. "Our souls are bound," she told him. "The ritual you performed created a bridge between life and death, a bridge I crossed to return to you. Now you must cross it to join me." "Please," William begged, falling to his knees. "I was mad with grief. I didn't understand what I was doing. Yet you did it all the same," Abigail replied without mercy. "Actions have consequences, my love, even those born of desperation." Dr. Bennett, who had been watching this exchange with growing comprehension, suddenly stepped forward. "The book," he said urgently. "William, where's the book the man in Richmond gave you?" William blinked, momentarily confused by the question. "In my quarters at Monroe Estate, hidden beneath the floorboards." "We need that book," Dr. Bennett insisted, turning to Thomas. "There may be a way to undo this, to release Abigail's soul from its unnatural state." Thomas nodded grimly. "Go, bring it here with all haste." But Abigail laughed, the sound like wind through dead branches. "You think to undo what has been done? The veil between worlds has been torn. It cannot be mended so easily." Dr. Bennett met her gaze unflinchingly. "Perhaps not, but I suspect the man who provided this knowledge to William did not share everything. Such practitioners rarely do. There may be a way to complete the ritual properly, to grant you true peace. The only peace I seek is to have William beside me," Abigail replied, her cold fingers tightening once more around her fiancé's arm. "As he promised, and if there were another way," Thomas asked desperately. "A way for you to find rest without dragging William to his death?" Abigail tilted her head, considering. What could possibly equal the weight of his promise? "Love," Thomas said simply. "Not the desperate, possessive love that would condemn him to death, but the true love that seeks the other's happiness above all else." For a long moment, Abigail stood motionless, her expression unreadable. The fog swirled around them, giving the impression that they stood suspended between worlds. "Bring the book," she finally said, releasing William so suddenly that he stumbled backward. "We shall see what truths it holds." Dr. Bennett departed immediately, his lantern bobbing through the fog as he hurried back toward the house. Thomas remained with Abigail and William, the three of them locked in an uneasy standoff among the gravestones. "Did you ever truly love me?" Abigail asked William after a long silence. "With all my heart," he answered, his voice steadier now. "I would have given anything to save you from the fever. Yet you fear to join me now." "I fear what you have become," William admitted. Not Abigail as she was gentle, compassionate, full of life, but something else. Something that speaks with her voice but lacks her heart. Abigail's expression flickered with what might have been hurt. "Death changes one," she said quietly, "as does being buried alive." Thomas winced at her words. The possibility that they had indeed buried his daughter in a cataleptic state, conscious, but unable to signal her condition, was a horror too great to contemplate. "If I could take your place, I would," he told her, tears streaming down his weathered face. A father should never outlive his child. Abigail turned to him, her expression softening once more. "You have suffered enough, father. Your guilt is misplaced. It was not your hand that placed me in that coffin." As they spoke, Dr. Bennett returned, clutching a small, leather-bound volume. Its cover was unmarked, its pages yellowed with age. "I found it," he announced, slightly breathless from his hurried journey. William approached cautiously, eyeing the book with a mixture of hope and dread. "Can you read it?" "The script is unlike any I've seen." Dr. Bennett opened the volume carefully, tilting it toward his lantern. "Some of it appears to be Latin, interspersed with symbols I don't recognize. But there are notes in English in the margins, perhaps made by the man in Richmond." He flipped through the pages until he found the section William had used for his ritual. "Here," he said, scanning the text. "This speaks of calling back a soul from beyond the veil. But look, there's more that follows, pages that appear to have been deliberately concealed." Indeed, several pages had been stuck together, separating only now under Dr. Bennett's careful manipulation. "As I suspected," he murmured, "the ritual is incomplete. There is a second part, completion, that must be performed to settle the soul properly in its returned state, or to release it entirely," Thomas suggested, glancing at his daughter. Dr. Bennett nodded grimly. "According to these notes, the soul exists in a liminal state until the ritual is completed, neither fully returned to life nor at peace in death, exactly as Abigail has described her condition." "What must be done?" William asked, stepping closer to examine the book. "There must be an offering," Dr. Bennett read, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Not of life, as Abigail believed, but of remembrance. A token of pure love, freely given to anchor the soul either in this world or guide it to the next." All eyes turned to Abigail, who stood motionless, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "A token of pure love," Thomas repeated softly. "What could that be?" "I know," William said suddenly, reaching into his waistcoat pocket. He withdrew a small object that caught the lantern light, Abigail's locket, the one containing a lock of her hair that he had used in the original ritual. "This belongs to you, Abigail. I took it from your body before burial, to use in the ritual. It was wrong of me." He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "I return it now, freely and with love, not the selfish love that would bind you to an unnatural existence, but the true love that wishes for your peace, whatever form that must take." Abigail stared at the locket, her expression flickering between longing and fear. Slowly she extended her hand. As her cold fingers closed around the locket, a change came over her. The unnatural light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a profound weariness. "I'm so tired," she whispered, clutching the locket to her chest. "So very tired." Dawn approached, turning the eastern sky a pale gray above the mist that still shrouded Monroe estate. In the cemetery, Abigail sat upon a stone bench near her empty grave, the locket clutched in her hands. Thomas, William, and Dr. Bennett maintained a respectful distance, conferring in hushed tones. "The book speaks of a choice, Doctor," Bennett explained, the ancient volume open before him. "When the token is returned, the soul must decide to remain in the world of the living, or to continue its journey beyond the veil." "And if she chooses to stay?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "What then? She cannot continue, as she is neither alive nor dead." Dr. Bennett turned a page, frowning at the cryptic text. "According to this, the completion of the ritual would restore her fully to life, but at a cost." "What cost?" William demanded. "A year of life from the one who performed the ritual. You, William, for each day she remains." William blanched. "And how long has she been?" "Returned." 3 days, Thomas said quietly. 3 years of your life." "A small price," William replied after a moment's consideration. "I would give it gladly if it meant Abigail could live again. But would she be truly restored?" Thomas pressed, glancing at his daughter's pale form. "Or would she be merely a shadow of herself, forever marked by her experience?" No one had an answer to this question. The 3 men fell silent, watching as Abigail opened the locket, studying the curl of her own hair preserved within. After what seemed an eternity, she rose and approached them, her movements more fluid now, less unnaturally rigid. "I have made my decision," she announced, her voice stronger than before but still carrying an otherworldly quality. The men waited, barely breathing. "I choose neither," Abigail said, her gaze moving from her father to William, and finally settling on Dr. Bennett with his ancient book. "This ritual is an abomination. It violates the natural order that you spoke of, Doctor. I will not perpetuate such a violation." "But Abigail," William protested, stepping forward, "you could live again. We could be together as we planned." She shook her head, a sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. "At what cost, William? Years of your life. And what of the price not written in that book, the price to my soul for defying death's rightful claim?" Thomas moved to his daughter's side, tears glistening in his eyes. "What would you have us do, my child?" "Complete the ritual properly, she replied, closing the locket with a soft click. "Not to bind me to this world or to draw William into death, but to release me, to let me go in peace." Dr. Bennett consulted the book once more. "There is a passage here about release," he confirmed. "A ritual of farewell rather than restoration." "Then that is what we must do," Abigail said firmly, "before sunrise. Before I lose the courage to leave all that I have loved." The preparation was simple but solemn. At Abigail's instruction, they gathered at her gravesite. The empty coffin was removed from the ground and placed beside the open grave. Fresh flowers, roses from the greenhouse, were laid upon it. Thomas brought Abigail's favorite books of William, her sheet music, and Dr. Bennett a small silver bell that had stood on her bedside table. "Symbols of who I was in life," Abigail explained, arranging these items with care. "Tokens to remind my soul of its earthly attachments, so that I might consciously release them." As the sky lightened further, Dr. Bennett read from the book, his Latin pronunciation halting but earnest. Thomas and William stood on either side of Abigail, supporting her as her strength seemed to wane with the approach of dawn. "There are words you must speak," Dr. Bennett told her, indicating a passage in the book. "Words of release and farewell." Abigail nodded, her form now seeming less substantial, as if she were fading with the night. She took the book with trembling hands and read the indicated passage, her voice gaining strength with each word. When she finished, she turned first to her father. "Thank you for your love," she said softly, placing a cold hand against his cheek. "Find peace in knowing I have found mine." To William she offered the locket. "Keep this, not as a token of binding, but as a memory of what we shared. Love again, William. Promise me that." William took the locket, tears streaming down his face. "I promise," he whispered, "though none will ever hold my heart as you have." Finally, Abigail stepped back, addressing all three men. "What happened here must never be spoken of beyond this place. The ritual, the book all, must be destroyed. Some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, some doors not meant to be opened." Dr. Bennett nodded grimly, closing the book. "I will see it done." As the first rays of sunlight pierced the fog, illuminating the cemetery in a golden glow, a remarkable transformation came over Abigail. The unnatural pallor of her skin seemed to warm, the darkness around her eyes receded, and for a brief, breathtaking moment she appeared exactly as she had in life. Beautiful, vibrant, full of the promise that had been so cruelly cut short. "Goodbye," she said simply, her voice once more her own. Then, as the sunlight touched her fully, Abigail Monroe, or what remained of her earthly form, dissolved into the morning light, like mist before the sun. Where she had stood, a single perfect rose petal drifted to the ground. Thomas fell to his knees, overcome. William stood motionless, the locket clutched in his hand. Dr. Bennett made the sign of the cross. Science and superstition merging in this moment beyond rational explanation. The bride who had returned from the grave was gone, this time finding the peace that had eluded her in both life and death. 1 year later, Monroe Estate stood much as it always had, its white columns gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Yet profound changes had occurred within its walls. Thomas Monroe, aged beyond his years by grief and the unnatural events he had witnessed, could become a recluse, rarely venturing beyond his study where he pored over theological texts, seeking answers to questions that haunted his sleepless nights. William Harrington had departed Virginia entirely, traveling first to Boston and then, according to correspondence received by Dr. Bennett, to Europe. His letters spoke of a restless searching, a man trying to outrun memories that followed him across oceans. Dr. Bennett remained in the community, continuing his medical practice with a newfound humility regarding the limits of scientific understanding. He had honored Abigail's final request, burning the ancient book on the night of her release. Yet the knowledge it had contained and the questions it had raised continued to occupy his thoughts. The Monroe family cemetery had been restored to its former dignity. Abigail's grave, once a disturbed wound in the earth, now lay peaceful beneath a simple headstone that read only her name and dates, with the addition of a single line, "Beloved, at rest." On the anniversary of her death, or perhaps her second death, Thomas Monroe hosted a small gathering at the estate. Dr. Bennett attended, as did Reverend Clark and a few trusted neighbors who knew nothing of the true circumstances surrounding Abigail's passing. After a simple meal, Thomas led his guests to the newly constructed conservatory at the rear of the house, a glass and iron structure filled with roses of every variety, Abigail's favorite flower blooming in perpetual tribute to her memory. "A fitting memorial," Dr. Bennett commented as he and Thomas stood alone in the conservatory after the other guests had departed. "Beauty emerging from tragedy." Thomas nodded, gently touching a white rose in full bloom. "I find solace here. Sometimes when the light falls just so through the glass, I fancy I can see her among the flowers, at peace at last." Dr. Bennett studied his friend's face. noting the lines of grief that had become permanently etched there over the past year. Do you ever regret the choice made that night, to release her rather than attempt to restore her fully? Thomas was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. No, he said finally. What returned to us was not truly Abigail, not completely. She recognized this, even if in our grief and desperation we did not wish to see it. She chose the more difficult path for all of us. The right path, Dr. Bennett agreed. Though I confess there are nights when my scientific curiosity wonders what might have been possible had we chosen differently. Some knowledge is better left unexplored, Thomas replied, his voice hardening slightly. Some boundaries not meant to be crossed. Abigail understood this. In the end, she showed more wisdom than any of us. As they spoke, Sarah entered the conservatory carrying a silver tray with brandy and glasses. Now the Monroe estate's housekeeper following Cook's retirement, she had remained loyal to Thomas despite the terror she had experienced. "Will there be anything else, sir?" she asked, setting down the tray. "No, thank you, Sarah," Thomas replied. "Though perhaps you might tell Dr. Bennett what you told me this morning." Sarah hesitated, a flush rising to her cheeks. "It was nothing, sir. Just a fancy." "Please," Thomas encouraged gently. "It would ease my mind to have another's perspective." Sarah took a deep breath. "Very well. This morning, as I was cutting roses for the dining table, I heard music a pianoforte playing a piece that Miss Abigail used to practice. Clear as day it was, coming from the music room. But when I went to look, the room was empty, the pianoforte closed and untouched." Dr. Bennett raised an eyebrow. "A curious occurrence." "There's more," Sarah continued, gaining confidence. "As I stood there puzzled, I felt the lightest touch on my shoulder like a reassuring hand. And the scent of roses was suddenly overwhelming, though I'd left my cuttings in the kitchen." Thomas watched Dr. Bennett's reaction carefully. "What do you make of this, doctor? A manifestation of grief and memory, or something more?" Dr. Bennett considered his response carefully. "I believe," he said at length, "that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Whether your daughter's spirit truly walks these halls or whether she lives on only in the hearts and minds of those who loved her, does it matter? So long as the presence brings comfort rather than fear." Thomas smiled, a genuine smile that momentarily erased the grief from his features. "No, I suppose it doesn't." Later, as Dr. Bennett took his leave, the sun was setting over the Virginia countryside, bathing Monroe estate in golden light. At the entrance to the family cemetery he paused, drawn by some indefinable impulse to visit Abigail's grave once more. The small plot was immaculately maintained. Fresh roses placed before the headstone, white blooms edged with the faintest blush of pink, Abigail's favorite variety. As Dr. Bennett stood in silent contemplation, a cool breeze stirred the branches of the surrounding trees, sending a shower of autumn leaves spiraling to the ground. Among them, caught in the last rays of sunlight, drifted a single rose petal, though no roses grew near the cemetery. Dr. Bennett watched it float gently down to rest upon Abigail's headstone. He did not attempt to explain this small wonder, this minor defiance of the natural order he had spent his life studying. Instead, he bowed his head briefly, acknowledging mysteries beyond human understanding. "Rest well, Abigail Monroe," he murmured. "Bride no longer, but at peace at last." As he turned to leave, the breeze seemed to whisper through the trees, perhaps merely the wind, perhaps something more. And in that whisper, one might almost discern a young woman's voice, saying a final, contented farewell to the world she had left behind. In the years that followed, the story of Abigail Monroe was told and retold throughout Virginia, though never the true account, known only to 3 men who had taken its secrets to their graves. She became a local legend, the bride claimed by fever on the eve of her wedding, whose ghost was said to walk the grounds of Monroe estate when roses bloomed. Few suspected the truth, that Abigail had indeed returned, had walked among the living for 3 impossible days, and had ultimately chosen to release herself and those she loved from an unnatural bond, finding in that choice a peace that transcended both life and death. For in the end, it was not Williams's desperate ritual that had truly brought Abigail back, nor was it his broken promise that had summoned her from the grave. It was love, imperfect, human love, that had bridged the gap between worlds. And it was love, in its purest form, that had finally set her free.